In the vast and honestly often bewildering landscape of human knowledge, there exists this relentless drive to understand, to push the boundaries of what we know. This quest for discovery, a hallmark of our species, has led to some of our greatest achievements. It has cured diseases, sent us to the moon, and unlocked the very secrets of life itself. But this same insatiable curiosity has, at times, led us down darker, more treacherous paths. Paths where the line between noble inquiry and unforgivable transgression becomes blurred, and the cost of knowledge is measured in human suffering. Today, we embark on a journey into the shadows of scientific history. We will be counting down 10 of the most shocking, controversial, and ultimately banned experiments ever conducted. These are not tales of simple mistakes or minor miscalculations. They are stories of ambition overriding ethics, of curiosity twisting into cruelty. They are the experiments that forced us, as a global community, to confront the profound moral questions that lie at the very heart of the scientific endeavor. From psychological studies that spiraled into chaos, to secret government programs that treated human beings as mere subjects, these accounts are a stark reminder of the potential for science to go horribly wrong. Yet, it is through examining these very failures, these moments of profound ethical crisis, that we have forged the strict codes and regulations that protect us today. Some of these forbidden trials, in their own tragic way, changed the course of science forever, serving as chilling lessons that must never be forgotten as we continue to explore the unknown. Our journey begins in the summer of 1971, within the hallowed halls of Stanford University. Here, a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo conceived of an experiment to explore the power of situations on human behavior. He sought to understand the psychological dynamics that develop within a prison environment. To do this, he created a simulated prison in the basement of the psychology building, a controlled world of concrete and steel bars, where he could observe the unfolding drama. He recruited 24 young men, all deemed psychologically stable and healthy, to participate. They were randomly assigned to one of two roles, prisoner or guard. The prisoners were arrested unexpectedly at their homes by real police officers, a touch of realism that would prove to be a powerful catalyst. They were blindfolded, processed, and stripped of their identities, given only numbers. The guards, in contrast, were given uniforms, reflective sunglasses to conceal their eyes, and wooden batons. They were given a simple instruction: maintain order. What unfolded was a terrifyingly rapid descent into psychological abuse. The guards, ordinary students just days before, began to exhibit sadistic and authoritarian behaviors. They used humiliation as a tool, forcing prisoners to perform push-ups as punishment, stripping them naked, and subjecting them to sleep deprivation. The power of the uniform and the situation seemed to strip away their individual sense of morality, replacing it with a collective, brutal identity. It was a stark illustration of how easily a person can transform when given unchecked authority. The prisoners, in turn, began to show signs of extreme emotional distress. They became passive, helpless, and some experienced acute anxiety and depression. The simulated environment had become all too real. The lines between role-playing and genuine identity had completely dissolved. The distress was so palpable, so profound, that a visiting psychologist was horrified by what she witnessed. Her shocked reaction was a wake-up call to Zimbardo himself, who had become so engrossed in his role as prison superintendent that he had lost his objective scientific perspective. The experiment, originally planned for 2 weeks, was terminated after just 6 days. The psychological damage inflicted upon the participants was undeniable. The Stanford prison experiment became a landmark case, a chilling demonstration of the potent influence of social roles and power dynamics. It led to the establishment of much stricter ethical guidelines for psychological research, ensuring that the well-being of human participants would never again be so profoundly compromised in the name of science. It stands as a permanent cautionary tale of an experiment that succeeded too well. We now turn to one of the most infamous and, honestly, morally reprehensible episodes in the history of medical research. Beginning in 1932 in Macon County, Alabama, the United States Public Health Service initiated a study titled Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. Its stated purpose was to observe the natural progression of the disease over a long period. The subjects were 600 impoverished African American men, sharecroppers who had little access to education or health care. Of these 600 men, 399 had latent syphilis, while the remaining 201 served as a control group. The men were never informed of their true diagnosis. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a vague, colloquial term that could mean anything from syphilis to anemia. They were enticed to participate with promises of free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance. This deception formed the very foundation of the study, a betrayal of trust between doctor and patient. For 40 years, the study continued. The men were observed, their bodies catalogued as the disease ravaged them from within. They were subjected to painful and sometimes dangerous procedures like spinal taps, which were presented as special free treatments. All the while, the researchers actively prevented them from receiving any actual cure for their condition. This was not a passive observation. It was a deliberate act of withholding care for the sake of collecting data. The most egregious ethical violation occurred in the 1940s when penicillin became the standard effective treatment for syphilis. This life-saving cure was known to the researchers, yet it was deliberately denied to the men in the study. The scientists went to extraordinary lengths to ensure their subjects remained untreated, sharing lists with local doctors and even the military during World War II to prevent them from receiving penicillin from other sources. The desire to see the final, fatal stages of the disease outweighed any sense of human decency. It was not until 1972, when an Associated Press reporter named Jean Heller broke the story, that the horrific truth was exposed to the public. The resulting outrage was immense and immediate. The study was shut down, and the survivors, along with the families of those who had died, received a settlement. The Tuskegee syphilis study led directly to the creation of the National Research Act and the establishment of institutional review boards, which are now required to approve and oversee all research involving human subjects in the United States. It is a permanent stain on medical history, a symbol of systemic racism and the catastrophic failure of ethical oversight. In 1939, at the University of Iowa, a speech pathologist named Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor embarked on an experiment that would later be known by a far more sinister name, the Monster Study. Their research aimed to investigate a deeply debated question in their field: was stuttering a learned behavior caused by anxiety and negative feedback, or was it genetic? To find the answer, they chose a particularly vulnerable group of subjects, 22 children living in a state orphanage. The children were divided into two groups. One group consisted of children who already had a stutter. Half of these children were praised for their fluency and told they were good speakers, in an attempt to see if positive reinforcement could improve their speech. The other half were relentlessly criticized. They were told their speech was terrible, that they were stutterers, and that they should never speak unless they could do it right. This was the core of the cruel design. The second and more infamous group consisted of children who had perfectly normal speech. Half of these children were given praise, serving as a control. The other half, despite speaking fluently, were subjected to the same intense negative psychological conditioning as the stuttering group. Tudor and her colleagues systematically told these normally fluent children that they were beginning to stutter, that their speech was flawed, and that they must be careful. They were, in essence, trying to induce a stutter through psychological pressure. The results were devastating and immediate. The fluent children who received negative therapy began to exhibit the very symptoms they were told they had. They became withdrawn, anxious, and reluctant to speak. Their school performance suffered, and some developed lifelong speech problems and psychological scars. The experiment did not create stutterers in the clinical sense, but it inflicted profound emotional and psychological trauma, shattering the confidence of these orphaned children who had no one to advocate for them. Fearing the damage it would do to his reputation and the university's, Wendell Johnson never published the full data from the study. The truth was concealed for decades, hidden away in university archives. It was only brought to light by investigative journalists in the early 2000s. The university eventually issued a formal public apology, and several of the surviving orphans, now elderly, received a financial settlement from the state of Iowa. The Monster Study serves as a chilling example of scientific ambition, targeting the most defenseless among us, leaving a legacy of harm that lasted a lifetime. In 1961, just 3 months after the trial of the notorious Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann began, A Yale University psychologist named Stanley Milgram sought to understand a terrifying question. Could it be that Eichmann and his accomplices were just following orders? Could ordinary people be compelled to commit atrocities simply because they were told to do so by an authority figure? This question gave birth to one of the most famous and, honestly, ethically fraught experiments in the history of psychology. Participants were recruited through a newspaper ad for a study on memory and learning. Upon arrival at the lab, they were introduced to another participant, who was, in reality, an actor. A rigged draw always assigned the true participant to the role of teacher and the actor to the role of learner. The teacher was taken to a room with an imposing shock generator, a machine with switches ranging from 15 volts, labeled slight shock, all the way to 450 volts, labeled XXX. The teacher's task was to read word pairs to the learner, who was strapped into a chair in an adjacent room. For every incorrect answer, the teacher was instructed by a stern, lab-coated experimenter to administer an electric shock, increasing the voltage with each mistake. The learner, the actor, would grunt at lower voltages, cry out in pain at higher levels, complain of a heart condition, and eventually fall silent, as if unconscious or worse. The teacher, however, heard all of this. The true focus of the experiment was to see how far the teacher would go. When they hesitated or expressed concern, the experimenter would use a series of 4 prods. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue, and you have no other choice. You must go on. There was no physical force, only the psychological pressure of an authority figure insisting that the procedure be followed, absolving the teacher of responsibility. The results were, well, shocking. A staggering 65% of the participants continued to administer shocks all the way to the maximum 450-volt level, despite the learner's screams and eventual silence. These were ordinary people, teachers, engineers, postal workers, who, under the pressure of authority, were willing to perform acts that appeared to cause extreme harm to another human being. The experiment revealed a deeply unsettling aspect of human nature, but the ethical cost was immense. Participants experienced extreme stress, believing they had seriously injured or even killed someone, a psychological burden that raised profound questions about the ethics of deception and induced distress in research. We now descend into a chapter of scientific history so dark, it transcends the realm of unethical experimentation and enters the domain of pure, systematic atrocity. During the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II, the Imperial Japanese Army operated a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit known as Unit 731. Based near the city of Harbin in occupied Manchuria, this facility was a factory of death disguised as a water purification plant. The subjects of the experiments were not volunteers or even unknowing participants. They were prisoners, captured Chinese civilians, Koreans, Russians, and some Allied prisoners of war. They were referred to by the researchers as maruta, the Japanese word for logs, a dehumanizing term that facilitated the unspeakable cruelty inflicted upon them. These human beings were seen as nothing more than disposable material for research. The experiments conducted were a catalog of horrors. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and other deadly pathogens to study the course of the diseases. They were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, their organs removed while they were still alive to observe the effects of disease on living tissue. Some had limbs amputated and reattached to other parts of their bodies, or were frozen and then thawed to study the progression of frostbite and gangrene. The unit also tested weapons in the most gruesome ways imaginable. Prisoners were tied to stakes in open fields and used as human targets for biological weapons, germ-releasing bombs, chemical agents, and flamethrowers. They were placed in high-pressure chambers until their eyes popped from their sockets and spun in centrifuges until they died. The goal was to develop the most effective weapons of mass destruction, and, well, no act was considered too depraved in pursuit of that goal. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the leaders of Unit 731 were not brought to justice. Instead, in a shocking post-war decision, the United States granted immunity to the physicians and researchers involved in exchange for their data on human experimentation. The knowledge gained from these atrocities was deemed too valuable to lose. The work of Unit 731 stands as one of humanity's most profound moral failures, a place where the pursuit of knowledge became utterly divorced from any semblance of morality, ethics, or basic human compassion. In 1920, at Johns Hopkins University, the behaviorist John B. Watson, a towering figure in psychology, sought to demonstrate that emotions could be learned through classical conditioning. He wanted to prove that fear was not an innate, instinctual response, but something that could be instilled in a person. To test his hypothesis, he and his graduate student, Rosalie Rayner, conducted an experiment on a single, unsuspecting subject, a 9-month-old infant known to history only as Little Albert. Albert was, by all accounts, a stable and emotionally placid child. He was presented with a series of objects he had never seen before: a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, and various masks. He showed no fear of any of them. In fact, he was curious and would reach out to touch the animals. The white rat, in particular, seemed to elicit a positive response. This was the baseline, the blank slate upon which Watson intended to write the lesson of fear. The conditioning began. Each time the white rat was presented to Albert, Watson would stand behind the infant and strike a steel bar with a hammer, creating a sudden, loud, and frightening noise. The noise naturally startled Albert and made him cry. This process was repeated several times. The unconditioned stimulus, the loud noise, which caused an unconditioned response, fear, was paired with a neutral stimulus, the white rat. Soon the conditioning took hold. The mere sight of the white rat was enough to make Albert cry and attempt to crawl away in terror. He had learned to fear the rat, but the effect did not stop there. Watson discovered that the fear had generalized to other similar objects. Albert now showed signs of distress when presented with the rabbit, the dog, a fur coat, and even a Santa Claus mask with a white cotton beard. He had been conditioned to fear a whole class of furry objects. The experiment was a success from a scientific standpoint, demonstrating that phobias could indeed be conditioned. But ethically, it was a disaster. Watson and Rayner made no attempt to decondition Albert, to undo the fear they had instilled in him. Shortly after the experiment concluded, Albert was removed from the hospital where his mother worked, and his ultimate fate remains a subject of historical debate. The Little Albert experiment is now a staple in psychology textbooks, not only for its findings but as a primary example of ethically questionable research, particularly the act of inflicting psychological harm upon a child without consent or remediation. In the tense atmosphere of the Cold War, the United States Central Intelligence Agency became convinced that communist powers had developed drugs and techniques for mind control. Fearing a so-called brainwashing gap, the CIA initiated its own top-secret and illegal program of human experimentation in 1953. It was known by the cryptonym MKUltra. Its goal was simple, yet honestly terrifying: to discover methods of controlling the human mind. The project operated in extreme secrecy, with a vast network of sub-projects conducted at universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. Many of the researchers involved were completely unaware that they were working for the CIA. The program explored a wide array of potential mind control techniques, including hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, and various forms of psychological torture. But the most notorious aspect of MKUltra was its extensive experimentation with drugs, particularly LSD. The CIA was, well, fascinated by the hallucinogen's potential to break down a person's psyche and make them more susceptible to suggestion. They administered LSD and other potent chemicals to countless individuals, often without their knowledge or consent. Subjects included CIA employees, military personnel, doctors, government agents, sex workers, and members of the general public. In one infamous subproject known as Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA set up brothels in San Francisco and New York. Unwitting men were lured there, drugged with LSD, and then observed from behind two-way mirrors by CIA agents. The goal was to study the effects of the drug in a real-world setting and to see if it could be used to extract information or compromise individuals. These activities were a flagrant violation of law and human rights, conducted by an agency of the U.S. government against its own citizens. The full extent of MKUltra may never be known. In 1973, in a panic following the Watergate scandal, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all files related to the project to be destroyed. However, some documents survived due to a clerical error and were uncovered by congressional investigations in the mid-1970s. The revelations shocked the nation and exposed a dark, paranoid underbelly of the intelligence community. Project MKUltra remains a stark symbol of the abuse of power and the terrifying potential of secret government science operating without any ethical or legal constraints. During the 1970s and 80s, under the brutal system of apartheid, the South African Defence Force harbored a deep-seated institutional homophobia. Gay and lesbian soldiers were seen as a security risk, supposedly susceptible to blackmail, and considered unfit for service. This prejudice gave rise to a top-secret and deeply cruel medical program known as the Aversion Project, which was designed to cure soldiers of their homosexuality. The project was headed by Dr. Aubrey Levin, who was a colonel and chief psychiatrist at the Voortrekker Hoogte Military Hospital near Pretoria. Hundreds of gay and lesbian personnel, identified through a network of spies and informants, were forcibly sent to this facility, specifically Ward 22. They were told they were being treated for various fabricated psychological issues, but the true purpose was to change their sexual orientation through brutal aversion therapy. The methods used were honestly torturous. Male soldiers were shown pornographic images of men and encouraged to become aroused, at which point powerful and painful electric shocks would be administered to their arms. This process was repeated over and over in an attempt to create a conditioned negative association with same-sex attraction. The psychological torment was immense, as individuals were forced to associate their very identity with pain and fear. For female soldiers, the methods were different, but absolutely no less horrific. They were subjected to chemical castration, given drugs that would induce nausea while being shown images of women. In the most extreme and tragic cases, when aversion therapy was deemed to have failed, some soldiers were subjected to forced sexual reassignment surgery. These individuals, mostly conscripts aged between 16 and 24, were surgically and chemically altered against their will, their identities mutilated by the state they were forced to serve. The Aversion Project was a state-sanctioned program of torture, a medical atrocity born from prejudice and pseudoscience. After the end of apartheid, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission investigated these abuses, and the world learned of the horrors of Ward 22. Dr. Levin later moved to Canada, where he continued to practice as a psychiatrist until he was eventually convicted of sexually assaulting his patients, his legacy of abuse continuing for decades. The Aversion Project stands as a chilling reminder of how medical science can be weaponized to enforce social prejudice and inflict unimaginable suffering. The idea of a human Z, a hybrid of a human and a chimpanzee, has long occupied a space in the public imagination, a concept that's both fascinating and honestly deeply unsettling. Genetically, humans and chimpanzees share approximately 98% of their DNA, making them our closest living relatives in the animal kingdom. This genetic proximity has led a handful of scientists throughout history to explore the very real and very controversial possibility of creating a hybrid creature. The most well-documented attempt was made in the 1920s by the Soviet biologist Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov. A pioneer in the field of artificial insemination, Ivanov traveled to a primate research station in French Guiana with a bold and audacious plan. He intended to inseminate female chimpanzees with human sperm. He believed that proving such a hybrid was possible would be a powerful tool for anti-religious propaganda, striking a blow against creationist beliefs. His initial experiments in Africa were unsuccessful. The chimpanzees did not become pregnant, and logistical and ethical concerns from the local French government hampered his work. Undeterred, Ivanov returned to the Soviet Union with a new, even more disturbing plan. He would reverse the experiment. He established a research station in Georgia and recruited a group of Soviet women who volunteered to be inseminated with chimpanzee sperm. This phase of the experiment, however, was doomed from the start. The only male chimpanzee in his possession, an orangutan named Tarzan, died before the inseminations could be carried out. Soon after, Ivanov himself fell victim to the political purges sweeping the Soviet Union. He was arrested, exiled to Kazakhstan, and died shortly thereafter. His controversial research into the creation of a human Z died with him, at least for a time. While rumors of other, more recent attempts have surfaced, particularly in China in the 1960s, none have been substantiated. The ethical and moral objections to such an experiment are profound. What would be the legal and moral status of such a creature? Would it be a person or property? To create a being trapped between two species, likely suffering from severe physical and psychological issues, for the sake of scientific curiosity, is now almost universally condemned. Today, such experiments are banned in most countries, deemed a fundamental violation of both human and animal dignity. Our final entry takes us deep into the clandestine world of Soviet intelligence during the height of Stalin's rule. Hidden within the machinery of the state security apparatus, known then as the NKVD, was a secret research facility with a single chilling purpose: the development of tasteless, odorless, and untraceable poisons. This facility was known variously as Laboratory 1, Laboratory 12, and the Chamber, and its test subjects were human beings. The laboratory's mission was to create poisons that could be used for targeted assassinations, substances that would mimic a natural death, such as a heart attack, leaving no evidence of foul play. The scientists, under the direct command of spy master Lavrenti Beria, worked with a range of deadly compounds, including digitoxin, ricin, mustard gas, and curare. They experimented with different delivery methods, from powders in food to poisons administered via a spray or a hidden needle. The test subjects were prisoners of the Gulag, enemies of the people, and others deemed disposable by the totalitarian regime. These individuals were brought to the laboratory under the guise of receiving medical treatment. They were given the experimental poisons in their meals or drinks, and then carefully observed by the doctors and scientists. The researchers would meticulously document the onset of symptoms, the duration of the agony, and the time until death. The goal was to find the perfect poison, one that was lethal in small doses and left no post-mortem trace. According to testimony from former Soviet intelligence officers who later defected, the experiments were cold, clinical, and utterly devoid of compassion. The victims were of different ages, genders, and physical conditions, allowing the researchers to study the effects of the poisons on a varied population. It was a production line of murder, all in the service of state-sponsored terror. The work of the poison laboratory did not end with the death of Stalin. It continued under the KGB, and its deadly creations were allegedly used in assassinations for decades, most famously in the 1978 murder of Bulgarian dissident Georgy Markov in London, who was killed with a ricin pellet fired from a modified umbrella. The Soviet poison laboratory represents the ultimate perversion of medical science, where the knowledge of healing was twisted into the art of killing, turning doctors into state-sanctioned executioners and human beings into mere data points in a lethal equation. The stories we have explored today are not merely historical footnotes. They are profound and enduring warnings. They illustrate a fundamental truth: the quest for knowledge, for all its nobility, can never be divorced from the moral and ethical responsibilities we have to one another. Science without a conscience, as these 10 examples show with terrifying clarity, can become one of the most destructive forces imaginable. It can justify torture, rationalize cruelty, and reduce human life to a variable in an equation. The lab coat offers no immunity from the basic tenets of human decency. The ethical frameworks that now govern scientific research, informed consent, institutional review boards, the principle of do no harm, were not gifted to us. They were born from these very tragedies. They are the guardrails built around the abyss, forged in the fires of past transgressions to protect future generations. It is our collective duty to remain vigilant, to question the powerful, and to ensure that the pursuit of understanding never again comes at the cost of our humanity. The weight of this knowledge is heavy, but it is a burden we must all carry. As we conclude our journey through these dark chapters of science, we are left with many unsettling questions. The line between right and wrong can sometimes seem clear, but as we've seen, it can also be dangerously blurred by ambition, ideology, or the simple, insidious pressure to obey. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Which of these experiments shocked you the most? And what lessons do you believe we must carry forward from these cautionary tales? Thank you for watching.